Welcome to Environmental Ethics. My name is Mark Thorsby, and today what we're going to be talking about is Thomas Aquinas. And we're just going to be looking at a small excerpt from his work, which explores his understanding of what our relationship is to the environment. I think I've sort of subtitled this discussion as religious anthropocentrism. And the reason I've done so is because in our last video we talked about what anthropocentrism is, and now what we want to do is kind of build up into the history of contemporary environmental ethical theory. But before we do that, I think what we need to do is we need to step backwards and look at the history, or at least some aspect of that history. And we've chosen some representative figures within the history of philosophy. And we want to kind of look back at that history and get a sense of where we've been and where we've come from. And I also think it's important to note that, of course, Thomas Aquinas is going to argue for the anthropocentric position. But to be fair, if he was here, he would probably say it's not an anthropocentric position, but rather a theopocentric position. And theopocentrism, which I'm pretty sure isn't a word, I've just made it up just now, is the idea of a God-centered understanding of everything. And so I think, to be fair, that's what he would probably say his position is ultimately it's about God and the relationship of God. Now, in terms of the way in which contemporary philosophers today understand that history of religious and moral and ethical thought, it's classified as a form of anthropocentrism. But I think it's worth at least making that caveat, because Aquinas actually offers a number of interesting arguments, and they're actually valid arguments. Whether or not they're true is a secondary question. But he offers some really interesting logical arguments in favor of his position. Now, in order to understand those arguments, you have to also, if you will, put yourself in his position, his philosophical, intellectual, and cultural moment. He's living in the Middle Ages. The language of scholarship is in Latin, and that's because ultimately, up until this point, and really beginning with him, remember, he taught at the University of Paris in its initial years, if you will, compared to where it is today. So he's a professor in a sort of medieval, but bordering line on a sort of modern sense. In other words, we could say that Aquinas offers intellectual arguments for his position and not simply dogmatic positions. But he does assume a set of axioms, if you will, or principles that he's not going to question. Number one, of course, is the Christian worldview in which he's living in. So he accepts, for instance, a whole range of ideas that are ultimately rooted within the Christian tradition. Now, he doesn't see it as a Christian tradition because, we should be fair, he really believes what he's saying. And so as we go through in our series on environmental ethics, I think it's important that we don't just necessarily characterize these thinkers in one fashion or another, which maybe I think our book does to some extent, but we also recognize the argumentative tradition. This is a sort of great conversation, if you will. So let's take a look at Aquinas' position. So, and what I'm just going to walk through, I encourage you to read his text, but I'm going to kind of walk through a couple of important things that he's going to argue. The first and essential thing we need to understand is the central role of rational creatures within the divine order. So Aquinas assumes the great chain of being, or as he argues for it, right, is that there's a great chain of being. God's at the top, then you have angels, and then you have human beings, and so forth. And Aquinas himself articulates what these levels are. Now, of course, God, he also has to recognize that Aquinas is both an Aristotelian. When he talks in his writings, or writes, rather, in the Summa, whenever he refers to the philosopher, he's talking about Aristotle, but he's also adopted and is aware of the Platonic tradition. And so he's something of a combination of Plato and Aristotle. And if you know about that, then you'll recognize that both for Plato and Aristotle is the importance of the mind, or nous, the way in which the mind is able to capture the universal forms that embody the universe, as it were. And so Aquinas is within that ancient tradition, or he's coming out of it, or he's aware of it, or influenced by it, by that tradition. But ultimately, for him and his argument is the central role of rational creatures. This is important because human beings are rational creatures, or at least we're capable of being rational creatures. So what Aquinas is going to articulate is a medieval perspective that places rational beings, of course, including humans, but also angels, at the forefront of the divine order. You might say this is the argument for the great chain of being. He asserts that these rational beings have dominion over their own actions, which distinguishes them from non-rational entities that lack autonomy. Now, this is where things get sort of interesting with Aquinas. So Aquinas' view here is going to be, ultimately, what reason enables human beings to do is to understand the world and not simply react to it. The way in which, for instance, animals react instinctually, and that includes human beings. We also react instinctually. But human beings are also rational creatures. We have a mind that enables us to organize and begin to understand the world. And when we understand the world, that's when we're actually able to be free. That's when we're actually able to make choices. Notice, for instance, if someone jumps out at you, from behind a corner and you scream, that's your instinct. You don't really have control or freedom over that. But notice that, for instance, when you're choosing to read a book, right, whether it's fiction or non-fiction, let's say, when you're choosing to read a book, you're using reasons and ways to think about it. And by thinking about it, on the one hand, it creates a separation between just reacting and the object. But it also enables you to pick one choice or the other. So reason, or our rationality, is what enables us to be free. Now, in Aquinas' view, the most rational, if you will, the being with the most rationality, pure intellect itself, agent intellect, is God. Angels are also understood in this sense. So angels exist in a spiritual dimension for Aquinas. And I should mention here, I'm not a medieval or a religious scholar, so this is just my reading and my understanding of it. With that said, with that caveat said, is angels, for instance, don't have bodies, right? Bodies is what demarcates me from you. Angels instead have an intellectual sort of substance, a spiritual substance, but they're rational creatures as well. And Aquinas, now our reading doesn't go into this, probably because our editor is trying to be somewhat gentle with our reading here, or at least keep us on track, is Aquinas also demarcates that men, for instance, are more rational than women, and women are more rational than children, and so on and so forth. And so in that same sense, there's also this type of sexism that's going on, even though it's not totally clear here. And maybe some people will still defend that. I certainly don't. Now, what does this mean, though? It means that Aquinas has a worldview that's where you have a structure, and the structure is based upon freedom, but also simultaneously that freedom is interlaid by intellectuality, the pure forms of the mind, right? Think, for instance, when you're able to add 2 + 2 = 4 and able to do mathematics, that enables you to understand the world. And notice when you think mathematics, you're thinking thoughts that never change. They're eternal. So ultimately what this means is that divine providence provides for human beings what they need, at least in Aquinas' view. So non-rational creatures, by contrast, lack rationality and therefore can't make choices, and therefore they are just to be ruled as instruments because all they can do is react one from another. In a future video, we're going to look at Descartes' view, which is that animals are essentially mechanistic creatures like machines. But it really comes out of this view, or this argument, which is that animals, or the natural world, doesn't appear to make choices, whereas human beings do, and what enables that is our rationality. And that's going to be a sort of fulcrum element of the whole thing. Now, we already mentioned this in our last video, but let's remind ourselves of the distinction between two types of values. There's intrinsic value on the one hand, which is when we talk about something which is valued for its own sake, something is an end unto itself. Whereas instrumental value means something is valued as a means. Something is valued for the sake of some other purpose. And I think I gave the example of my coffee cup, right? My coffee cup has instrumental value because I value it for the sake of being able to drink water or coffee or whatever. Whereas, for instance, I value another person, let's say my wife. I value her not because she's useful for me, even though she is useful for me. It does have instrumental value, but I ultimately value her for her own sake. Right? Think about people who sacrifice themselves. When someone sacrifices themselves for something, that means they turn themselves into a means, which means it's a means unto something else, which has the value, right? So for instance, when a person sacrifices himself and saves another, they're recognizing the intrinsic value of the other, right? Or if someone sacrifices themselves, for instance, the ideals of their nation, then they hold that the ideals of the nation have an intrinsic value, or maybe have an intrinsic value potentially, right? Or they're an instrumental value towards a greater intrinsic value. At the end of all of the things that we value, ultimately has to be something which is valued for its own sake. Everything can't be just purely instrumental in terms of its value. Because if it were, then it would raise the question of why we value things as a means, ultimately. So let's keep that distinction in mind. And by the way, let me go back here and say that when we talk about instrumental value, we're going to see that Aquinas' position is ultimately that animals and nature, the environment, has instrumental value, whereas human beings have intrinsic value. And it's because of this distinction between rational and non-rational creatures, or creation, if you will. So let's talk a little bit about divine providence and all of this. So Aquinas' view is that human beings, as rational creatures, can use animals, and therefore God has given human beings nature in order to use it. So rational creatures, including angels, possess this ability to govern their own actions, which sets them apart from non-rational beings, which enables them to have dominion or control or power over non-rational ends. So for instance, so then Aquinas will argue that divine providence is what provides for rational beings. Divine providence, that's God's power and will, is directed towards these rational creatures to ensure their needs, that their needs can be met for their own sake. Now, since they're rational free creatures, they have intrinsic value, and God recognizes that, and that's why God enables the rest of the environment to exist for these agents. So this reflects the inherent value ultimately human beings have within the grand scheme of creation. Now, why would Aquinas say that we have this ability? Well, ultimately it's because God has gifted us some part of himself. Now, non-rational creatures are therefore instruments. So that means that the trees, the park, and by the way, notice here is that, all of the environment, the laws of physics themselves are all instruments that have been created for human beings. Now, I should say laws of physics are instruments, but they're the conditions by which all of these things can take place. So, in contrast, non-rational creatures, let's just say animals. In fact, my dog is sitting right here, so I'm looking at my dog and my cat. They're both right there. Right? These creatures, according to Aquinas, aren't rational, and therefore they don't have control over their own actions, and therefore instead they are instruments that serve the needs of rational beings. That's basically what Aquinas' view is. Now, that means that we can make this distinction between freedom and slavery in creation. Human beings have freedom insofar as they're rational, and there's slavery in which sense that there's a certain part of creation, a certain part of the natural world that has no freedom because it has no choice, because it has no reason. So freedom belongs to those with control over their own actions. Rational beings are free, and all the others therefore are enslaved to necessity. So providence therefore makes provision for rational beings as ends, but for others, the provisions are only made to treat them as a means unto an end. So this means that Aquinas holds what we call a teleological hierarchy of ends. This notion of teleology, what this means is the Greek term telos means end or goal. So teleology means like the logic of the ends, right? So this means that ultimately the natural world is organized according to specific ends. So this is a teleological hierarchy of ends when we think of what nature is. So in this structured hierarchy, Aquinas gives the example of an army. And I think it's actually a helpful analogy to kind of make sense of how his thinking is actually quite grounded, right? In a structured hierarchy, an army always acts towards an end. So if you have an army that's waging war, the goal of the army is to win the war, obviously, right? So that means that, let's imagine just the army itself. The priority, who's most valuable in that army, is going to be the actively fighting soldiers, or the soldiers who can actually wage the war, right? They're the final end, because they're therefore required for their own sake. You have to have them for the army, right? To be an army. Now, there's more soldiers, of course, in any army than just the people who are actually on the front lines with swords in Aquinas' day, or with weapons and drones in our own day, right? There has to be more than just those people. There has to be support soldiers, right? People who help the other soldiers do the fighting. Think about, for instance, the people who train other soldiers. The trainer is not at war, so they're sort of a secondary. And think about it this way: if a person is training someone in basic to move on to become a fighting soldier, the trainer is secondary, right? They're an instrument towards the end of the fighting soldier. So these other roles, such as, he gives the example of horse keepers and armorers, and these sorts of support roles, they exist to support these soldiers' success. So this is a sort of an analogy of what God is doing, right? God is the person directing the army. Who's the army? Well, human beings are the ones fighting the war because we have the rational freedom. And therefore, all of the rest of the army, all of the rest of the natural environment exist for their support. That's the analogy that Aquinas gives here. So, in the same sense, God is the ultimate end, and only intellectual creatures can reach him directly through their knowledge and love. But ultimately, because human beings have this intrinsic value as rational creatures, the natural environmental world is organized to support the needs of the rational community. Now, to be clear here, this is a type of anthropocentrism, though, right? Because what Aquinas is saying is that ultimately, at the center of the earthly creation is the human being. So it is a form of, I would say, pocketed anthropocentrism within a larger theocentrism. Now, intellectual creatures therefore have to be understood as being ends in themselves. And we're going to see this discussion about human beings being having intrinsic value all the way through up into the contemporary period, where human beings are still, to this day, usually regarded in moral theory as being intrinsically valuable because of their rationality. So it's sort of interesting. On the one hand, I think that our authors, and I think the general tradition of environmental ethics, is to try to reject Aquinas' anthropocentrism. We should recognize, though, that this sort of anthropocentrism still persists in many ways in our own intellectual tradition, even within the domain of environmental ethics. So let's talk a little bit about the principal parts of the environment and what their purposes are. And to do this, we have to understand we're talking about the relationship between parts and wholes, an interesting logical subject. So in any whole, right, you have a whole thing, a whole pie, let's say, the principal parts exist for themselves and the lesser parts exist for their preservation. So let me use not the example of a pie. Let me use the example of, for instance, a car, right? All of these parts of the car exist for the car as a whole, right? So the parts service the whole. Now, intellectual creatures hold the highest place in the universe for Aquinas. They're the closest to the divine likeness of pure mind, I guess, nous. Thus, providence provides for intellectual creatures for their own sake, and all the rest in that way. So in an organized whole, the key components or principal parts exist for their own intrinsic value, while subordinate parts function primarily to preserve and support these principal components. Intellectual creatures, like human beings or angels, occupy this highest tier in the cosmic hierarchy. So this is the great chain of being. Now, there is a relation of intellectual creatures to the universe, right? So what is the relationship? Well, obviously it has to do with the relationship between intellectual creatures who exist embodied in the world, human beings, and their relationship to the divine, the pure divine, the absolute, the first cause. And that would be God, of course, right? So we have to understand the place. So the key concept here is that all the parts of the universe contribute to the perfection of the whole, and this establishes the hierarchy of intellectual creatures, because ultimately intellectual creatures can do the most in terms of that relationship. So that means that what is the relationship? His view is divine care. So God's providence, God cares for human beings, and God's providence extends to non-rational creatures as well, but only as they serve the greater good and the needs of the intellectual creatures. So God does have a relationship with the environment for Aquinas. It's not just that God just has a relationship with us. God has a relationship with the environment too. Now, based upon that relationship, that division between the divine care for the environment and human beings, right? Human beings have a hierarchy of order, but there is a way in which you could say that evil can take place. If human beings use their rational capacities to choose to destroy the environment, right? Then that denies, or that goes against this notion of divine care. So even within Aquinas' view, there still can be such a thing as environmental evils or sins related to the environment. And here, for instance, Aquinas doesn't talk a lot about this, but the contemporary Catholic Church does. And remember, Aquinas is the central philosopher for the Catholic Church. So if you're interested in learning more about this, take a look at what their theological interpretations are, and they'll likely match or mirror Aquinas' view. And they'll probably quote Aquinas directly. So why do we use nature? So what is the purpose of using nature? Because you can see here, our relationship to the environment is therefore organized according to the purposes we need for it. If we don't fulfill those purposes, that would be morally wrong, right? So the question here is about the use of nature. Well, number one, nature is necessary for the contemplation of human beings. So there's a mirror of truth in the natural world. And by that regard, we're able to think and recognize. If you've ever gone to the beach, and I hope you have, if you haven't, go. But if you've maybe gone to the beach, or maybe you've gone to a forest, and you've gone hiking, or you've sat in front of a mountain, or maybe just looked up as a child, up at the clouds as they floated across the sky. And it opened to you a realm in which you could contemplate the universe, contemplate truth. I think we've all had that experience. So, number one, as intellectual creatures, nature stimulates the intellect. Number two, our use of nature has to do with our own ability to act and make actions. So, in order for me to do things, as a matter of skill, I have to learn how to manipulate the environment around me, right? That makes a lot of sense. So, for instance, if I need to chop down a tree, let's say, in order to start a fire so I don't freeze to death in the winter, then as a matter of skill, I have to learn to manipulate and use these natural substances. And finally, there's the sustenance that nature provides for us. After all, we're natural beings, and without nature, we literally consume the natural world instrumentally in order to live, right? And that's a fact. Whether or not you agree with Aquinas or not, we all do this. So in fact, all three of these things, contemplation, action, and sustenance, are reasons we use nature in Aquinas' view. Now, we have to recognize, though, for Aquinas, there's a difference here between ends which are eternal, which is where the mind hopefully is directed, I think, and the ends which are temporal, temporary, right? Things in mind, maybe more than just temporary, but the ends which exist within the temporal domain, within the dimension of time itself. So I'm living in the world right now. I'm recording this video. You're watching it, right? Which means that there's a timeline that's taking place, and there's ends which exist within time, but there's also, as it were, the infinite eternal ends, right? You can see here. So this is sort of interesting. So for Aquinas, he discusses the eternal will of God, right? He writes on page 64 of the Anthology, things derive their being from divine will. Whatever is always is willed by God for its own sake, and what is not always willed by God, not for its own sake, but for another's. Now, intellectual substances approach nearest to being always, since they're incorruptible. But let me stop there. What does he mean? When he says intellectual substances approach the closest to this because they're incorruptible, let's what's an example of that? Think of mathematics. It's very Platonic here, right? If I say the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, that formula is never going to change, right? Even if nuclear bombs go off and everything is eradicated, all human life is eradicated on Earth, the Pythagorean theorem will still be true. It's true by necessity, intellectually. And that necessity, therefore, has a form of eternality. Its eternality, right, it's eternal, and it's also intellectual, is therefore, as it were, a kind of substance that must be willed by God eternally. At least that's Aquinas' view. So that's what he means by intellectual substances approaching in the sense that they're incorruptible. Now, keep going. He writes, they are, moreover, unchangeable except in their choice. Now, wait a second. We, too, are also intellectual creatures. And this is what it means for us to have a soul in Aquinas' view. And in this sense, we have an immortal soul, an eternal soul, and that eternality, right, doesn't change except when we make choices, right? So there's a sort of interesting thing here. Remember, he's not just talking about mathematical formulas, he's also talking about all intellectual things. And in his worldview, God's at the top, angels exist, and there's lots of those, and of course human beings as well. So therefore, intellectual substances are governed for their own sake, as it were, and others for the sake of intellectual substances. Now, temporal beings' purpose. So in contrast, temporal beings like us are subject to change and corruption, serving a different purpose in the divine order. They exist not for their own sake, but for the sake of the eternal rational being. So these are the animals, the environment, etc. And they exist in order to provide the needs that are necessary to fulfill God's providential plan, which includes human beings, but is wider than just human beings. Now, this means we have to distinguish that for Aquinas, we can talk about the value of nature, and there's a role of non-rational creatures. Like Aquinas' view isn't that nature doesn't have any value. In fact, it has an essential value. Non-rational creatures, like animals, even though they're instrumental, they contribute to the overall perfection of the universe and the well-being of rational beings. So their existence serves a sort of dual purpose, enhancing both the intellectual sphere and the broader order of creation. Now, what is the purpose of these perishable beings? Well, perishable beings are not limited to serving only individual humans. They also exist for the benefit of humanity as a whole. So moreover, asserting that rational beings are cared for their own sake doesn't diminish the ultimate purpose of orienting towards God and the fulfillment of the universe's perfection. Now let me step back here. I kind of read through that. What is the meaning there? The meaning is that even though, I think this is the way I would interpret it, is even though Aquinas is endorsing the centrality of human beings within the environment because we're rational, eternal creatures, etc., Aquinas ultimately recognizes that the purpose of all of these beings ultimately is given to something greater than just human beings. It's ultimately God's purpose. So it's in this way that I would say that Aquinas really articulates a theopocentric view. Now, at the end of our reading, Aquinas, and I'm going to kind of go through this quickly, he offers a sort of biblical validation of human stewardship. So a key concept in environmental ethics, particularly within the Christian, or I would say the Judeo-Christian and Islamic perspective, would be this notion of stewardship. And so Aquinas is going to move in that direction. It's also part and parcel of the format of the way he's writing, because he's writing, he always does this. He'll always give an argument and then sort of end the argument by showing how the Bible confirms his view. And that's what he's doing in this section, right? He's going to argue that Scripture, in particular, and the Bible, supports the idea that God designed non-rational creatures primarily for the benefit of humanity. And he's going to look at particularly the book of Genesis, which, by the way, we should recognize the book of Genesis is a central text for three of the world's greatest religions. Or maybe not the central, maybe that's not the right way to say it, but is a sacred text for three of the world's great traditions, including Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. Now, and he shows that there are key verses which highlight this notion of stewardship. Now, stewardship, therefore, becomes the ethical concept. So now that Aquinas has explained to us how the place of human beings within the universe is given the sort of metaphysics of everything, now that we know that, then what is the relationship of human beings to the environment? The answer is stewardship. The human beings need to take care to preserve the natural world, to not be cruel to animals, but also to enable the natural world to flourish so that it can continue to be in service to the instrumental needs of humanity. So in this sense, there's a sort of kind of sustainability thesis, though it's not really articulated, but that's the direction that he is going to go. And that most religious environmental philosophers will probably take as well. Now, what are the implications for animals? Well, number one, Aquinas says there's restrictions in scripture, in the Bible, against cruelty to animals. So that means that it's a sin to be cruel to animals. And I think by extension, to destroy the natural environment. Aquinas argues that, for instance, these restrictions include the idea that we should prevent cruelty towards humans, and we should also prevent harm to humans, or this can also signify certain sorts of deeper truths. So animals serve human purposes, but we always have to consider the context of using using animals. So in cruelty has to be prevented, because that would be a violation of the natural order. And also wrong, because what cruelty does is it cultivates our ability to be cruel towards each other. Keep in mind that most, serial killers, when they're children, torture animals, right? So if you enable the cruelty towards animals, that also enables a cruelty towards human beings. And so we have to prevent harm to humans accordingly. So there's also symbolism in the way in which we treat animals. Treating animals with respect creates a sort of symbolism that helps instruct and represent the proper order of things. Now, Aquinas takes the perspective of a sort of natural law theory, so there's a sort of natural order of existence. But I think it's important here to recognize that when Aquinas is endorsing the notion that human beings are the center and that they can use the environment, stewardship is not an endorsement of cruelty, or I would say foolish interaction with the environment, right? I don't think Aquinas is saying that at all. And by the way, here's sort of a little map I wanted to give you of all the different arguments that he's sort of combining together. At the core of it, though, is this notion that rational beings are governed for their own sake by themselves, and since other beings aren't rational, they therefore exist purely as instruments, because they just exist within a continuum of necessary interactions that they can't control. And based upon that, this is why human beings, A, have their value, and B, it's why human beings are really are anthropocentric, not because, put it this way, there's a sort of anthropocentrism because that's the only way it can be, if human beings are the only rational creatures and the only ones capable of choice. So they're the only ones capable of using the environment and the natural world, the animals, etc. They can't actually make choices, and therefore they have no choice but to be instruments. So that's a little sort of broad, some broad brush strokes about what Aquinas' view is. But hopefully, as you read the text itself, you'll see that humans are the moral ends ultimately, or God's the moral end, I suppose, in another way. But that Aquinas provides a sort of interesting set of arguments in a sort of religious or theological or a philosophy of religion form of anthropocentrism. So I hope this helped you understand a little bit about the history of where our own anthropocentrism actually comes from, at least within the intellectual tradition. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you guys online. Bye.